until it's time to talk. Okay, so it is 3 o'clock. I'm going to broadcast now. Here we go. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's digital discussion. My name is Cynthia Gordigiwa, and I'm the marketing director at Publica. I'm here to welcome you all while we connect with everyone who signed up, and we'll get started in a moment just as soon as we have a critical mass of participants. Today, we'll hear from members of the reporting team behind a recent Publica investigation inside the fall of the CDC. The story details unprecedented White House meddling inside the CDC, as well as missteps and capitulations that the Public Health Agency made from the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak. Our reporters will share how they brought this powerful story to light, and I'll introduce them to you in just a moment. We'll also be answering your questions today. If you'd like to submit a question during the discussion, just click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen to type it in, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. If you've just joined us, welcome again. It looks like we have enough folks on to get started, so let's get to it. Again, my name is Cynthia Gordigiwa. I'm ProPublica's marketing director. I hope you've had a chance to read the story that our panelists will be discussing today. It's called Inside the Fall of the CDC. The story provides the most detailed look at how, from the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak, the CDC has been silenced and largely neutered through unprecedented political interference from the White House. Based on a trove of internal documents and emails, as well as interviews with more than 30 CDC employees, contractors, and Trump administration officials, the story gives a rarely seen perspective on what happens when career civil servants come under pressure to abandon their most deeply held principles. Bringing the series to light involved gaining access into the complex insular world of scientists and doctors, and today we'll hear about that from journalists who did it. They are reporters James Bandler, Patricia Callahan, Sebastian Rotella, research reporter Kirsten Berg, and the editor for this investigation, Tracy Weber. Again, if you'd like to submit a question at any time during the conversation, click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to type it in, and we'll get to those during the Q&A portion. But first, I'll throw it over to ProPublica Senior Editor, Tracy Weber. Tracy?
Hi, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us. I wanted to direct my first question to Trish, because when we assembled this team at ProPublica to look at the CDC, one of the biggest stories of the pandemic, none of us had any experience covering the CDC. We had no sources. We knew as much about the key players as pretty much as members of the public did. And we were competing against some of the finest journalists in the country. We joked among ourselves that we were laying down behind the starting line. But that ended up, in this particular project, that ended up to be a blessing in disguise. And Trish, can you tell us why that is so?
Yeah, so, when we started out, it was pretty daunting. And I think, having no sources, having no tipsters and no trove of documents was a big challenge, but we also had no preconceived notions. And so that, I think, worked in our advantage because it forced us to really do our homework and to start at the beginning and sort of get steeped in the history of the CDC. And so we started out, we read books, we read scholarly papers and GAO reports and sort of lessons learned memos on different responses. We found a very helpful archivist at the National Library of Medicine who got us access to thousands of records on the response to the H1n1 Flu Pandemic. And so, we really just kind of steeped ourselves in the history of the place. And there's also a tradition at the CDC of giving oral histories after a major outbreak. And so we listened to and read as many of those as we could get our hands on. And so when we did start calling people, I think it's possible that our questions might have been a little different than some other reporters in that, I think we were much more likely to have those initial conversations start like, I read this oral history you gave a decade ago, and this one thing you said, really stuck with me. And I wonder if we could talk about that and how maybe things are different now. And so I do feel like that the kind of the brave souls at the CDC who let us into their world could tell that we had a really deep respect for the place, and that we were also very humble about what we didn't know. And I also would say that, when we talk to people who used to work there, a lot of folks said, nobody at the CDC is ever going to talk to you. They're not people, scientists there just don't talk to reporters, and, you've never covered it before, they're not going to talk to you. And I would say that's probably one of the few things we didn't listen to, one of the only things we didn't listen to, in that we really had nothing to lose by casting a wide net. And we're very fortunate that ProPublica is the kind of organization that gives its reporters a lot of time and freedom and room to kind of roam and ask a lot of questions and to really dive in depth. And I also should mention that at one point in the early summer, we did go through the front door with the CDC and ask for interviews with, I can't remember, it's like a half dozen or a dozen people, leaders who had been involved in prior responses, particularly those who had worked on H1n1, because we noticed that some of the same people who were in leadership positions back then are in leadership positions now. And so we were really curious to learn, it's the same scientists, different virus, obviously, very different administration and very different outcome. And so we were interested in talking to them about what had changed and what was different this time around. And the answer we got from the media team at the CDC was, no, we're going to pass. And I don't know if they, thought we were going to go away or what, but, generally when someone says no like that to us, it just makes us look harder and to kind of work harder to find people who were familiar with what went on and who had access to emails and other documents, and to really kind of look under more rocks to figure out what was going on and sort of look for the breadcrumbs in the forest that would sort of lead us to learn about what was actually transpiring.
Okay, but at some point, we realized that, making cold calls to very skittish people in the midst of a pandemic was not going to get us inside the CDC. And we had really wanted to write a story about what was happening inside this institution. It was being painted as a failed institution or a victim, but what was going on? This was the premier public health agency. So James, you made a decision that helped us fulfill our journalistic dreams. What did you do, and how did that change the course of our story?
So it wasn't just my decision. It was a little bit of a nudge from you, Tracy, but I'd say in August, we were pretty frustrated as a team. The calling was not getting us the kind of inside detail we needed. And it's really hard. All of us as a reporting team are human reporters, where we need to go meet people. We need to go wine and dine them sometimes, or at least just look them in the eye. And being on the phone is just not satisfying. It's like a Zoom call is not satisfying. And we just felt like we really needed to do something different. We're all in our basements. It's a pandemic. It's not a good time in general to go meet people. So we were sort of at wit's end, and everyone is reporting from their basement. My basement was in Vermont. And, I quickly learned one thing you don't do as a reporter is talk to an infectious disease doctor with chickens in your basement. That is not a way to garner respect and trust, because chickens are a source of very bad diseases. And so, I was finding we have to go meet people. So the deciding thing was I got a text from you, Tracy. It was like a weekend day, and it was clear that you were a very patient person, but your patience was running out. And what you did was you sent this very, I thought, deft email or text to me. And you mentioned another reporter, this veteran reporter, Ginger Thompson, who was in a COVID zone in Georgia where she was door knocking. And you said, someone gave Ginger 1,000 pages of records because Ginger came down there, and that meant she was serious. And I was like, uh-oh, are we not serious reporters? So I got in my Prius a few days later. We all talked about it, and I drove to Atlanta. And I'm not going to talk much about the conversations we had because, our story was about the currency of trust, and we have trust with our sources, and we really strive to protect their anonymity. But what I can say is, we drove 2,800 miles. I drove 2,800 miles, knocked on a lot of doors, spent a lot of time waiting for people to show up outside their houses. One encounter was pretty funny, which the source did give me permission to describe. I showed up at night at a person's house, and the person came out. He came out in his pajamas, and I explained what I was doing. I made calls to this person, and this person looked at me. We stood staring at each other. I had my mask on for about 5 minutes, just sort of going back and forth. He goes, "This is really creepy." And he's like, "I'm in my pajamas." But then 5 minutes later, he handed me a beer. So, it really did work going down there and to see people in person. It was really critical. And I think without that, we would not have gotten sort of the fly in the wall details that you were so hungry for, Tracy, and the emotion which came through in these interviews. People wept in front of us because they were so heartbroken about what had happened to the agency, and the concessions and as one scientist was also, just rage came through. His voice was trembling with anger as he swore about what he said was the cowardice and the caving of senior leaders. So that really came through in our meetings with them, and it wouldn't have happened if you hadn't sent that nudge.
So one of the toughest parts of the story was a very, very key pivotal thing in the whole pandemic, and that is what happened in China. And China has been, even to this day, not very clear on how the virus started and what happened. And the CDC had built this long relationship with China, but when push came to shove, they failed to sort of get more information on what was going on. Sebastian, talk a little bit about like how it was to try to report that out. You've been reported really impressive investigative projects in some really tough countries. What was it like to figure out for this story what the heck was going on?
It was a challenge. It was obviously going to China was not an option, and it was comparable in some ways. I didn't have obviously experience covering pandemics, but it was comparable in some ways to the kind of reporting that I've done a lot as a foreign correspondent and an investigative correspondent, say after a big terrorist attack, including 9/11, or after assassinations, or after war crimes, where you try and go back and piece together not only what happened, but what the government's response was, right? And what were the successes and what were the failures. And so that was, as in the past, in covering those kinds of stories, it was a question of trying to figure out who was in a position to know, whether it was people within the CDC, within other government agencies, people in other governments, people in other countries, some of whom I knew, some of whom sources I already had led me to in the world of understanding the international work of the CDC, which after all is something that it's so renowned for, right? And it had to do, as the colleague said, had to do a lot of just basic reporting about the context, about this organization, how renowned it is, how active it is, this idea of the disease detective overseas, because ultimately what we were doing was talking to detectives who couldn't go to the scene of this massive crime, right? And they were trying to figure it out. So that was, that process included doing things like reading some of the great coverage that colleagues had done in 2003 of the SARS epidemic in China, which in some ways became almost like a template for understanding a lot what was going on with the pandemic in January of 2020. Because what you realized with reading and talking about people with SARS was that all these things that happen in terms of the Chinese regime, that the pattern of authoritarian and totalitarian regimes, which I've covered for a long time, is to deny and hide and delay. And the CDC was encountering all of this. And so that experience really informed the reporting. And as we were getting accounts of people of what those crucial initial weeks were like in January, we were then also getting emails where we could really pin down and start to put together a precise timeline. And what was really ironic and excruciating of the picture that came together was that the CDC for decades had been preparing for just this scenario, right? Especially after SARS. They understood how difficult it was to work in China. They understood what it was like to deal with that regime. So they had put all this time and effort into building up a presence in China and building up relationships, and both official and unofficial and direct and individual. And they had had some great success in terms of working on things like the flu and things like that. But when it came down to it, what the picture that came out was that the machinery of the CDC, starting on New Year's Eve, and we had all these very specific accounts of all these high-level officials reacting, the machinery reacting the way it was supposed to, and them trying to capitalize on these relationships and this presence and these networks, but then running in early January into this wall of silence. And the accounts and the emails are remarkable because you get this mounting sense of frustration and urgency as they're trying to talk to people who they talk to all the time in China and not getting results. And they know, and as you're writing it, that every day means an exponential increase potentially in infections and deaths. And trying to tell that story was a real challenge. Because the other thing was, what we soon saw was that this was the first sort of big stumble for the CDC in terms of within the Trump administration and the White House, right? Because the reaction of the White House by mid-January, when it was clear that the CDC wasn't getting the information it needed, wasn't getting a team into China like it had thought it would, was, why are you there? What are you doing? Your model doesn't work. And obviously that was only partly fair because this was China. If it had been Denmark, if it had been Ghana, things would have been different, right? But on the other hand, fair or not, what you realize after this was that this was the first big blow to the CDC, to its self-confidence, to its reputation within the government, and that this was going to set the tone for its reputation and its dealings with very powerful people within the administration, and for being behind the curve, for having lost these crucial weeks in terms of understanding and reacting to this pandemic.
Kirsten, I wanted you to share a little bit. This kind of goes back to both of the beginning of this, when we talked about starting with, from square one. And as anyone who's done a big project like this knows, one of the most challenging thing is figuring out everyone who you should talk to and not missing anyone that could be crucial and no one has ever talked to them before. And you built this massive infrastructure of sources and people who could be potential Sherpas for this story. And can you talk a little bit about how you did that and what role it played in our work here?
Sure. Related to, again, what Trish said about going in cold, one of the ways we tried to find ins was to build a map of potential sources at the CDC. This took the form of what became an enormous spreadsheet where we would add names of anyone that we thought might have insight. Again, going in cold, we didn't have a lot of preconceived notions about who was and wasn't worth talking to. So we cast a pretty wide net. We started a team of us, looked pretty early in the response for anyone who had worked in infectious respiratory diseases or pandemic preparedness. In the recent past, by looking through the CDC website and LinkedIn, I'd also scraped a bunch of names from the morbidity and mortality weekly reports, from FOIAs that I was getting back, from news clips, from briefings, from videos, from guidance documents, from conference presentations, oral histories, science journal articles, and more, really just hunting for names anywhere we could get them. In the end, our main sheet had 906 names in them. And with many of these individuals, we also had, as Trish had mentioned, sort of built these mini dossiers on them so we could have an understanding of what their current and formal roles were, who their colleagues were, what they've published, what they've said in oral histories, what they've said to their alumni magazine. And I think going into a cold call with that information was valuable for demonstrating that the team was doing their homework. And it was also valuable if people wouldn't talk to us or wouldn't talk to us right away, because we just had a much more human understanding of the people that make that institution.
So I wanted to ask a question of all of you because there was a lot of coverage of the CDC and individual events of the CDC, and we decided we wanted to tell the story a bit differently. And, we wanted to sort of get inside, and get inside means not just talking to people about it, but like recreating what happened at pivotal moments in this arc of what, the CDC going from global gold standard to an object of like anger and pity. And so how did looking at the story that way and setting out to report it and write it in that way change the way you did this reporting, and how did it make it more challenging?
Well, I think one of the challenges was, we were finally getting information and getting sources to provide us with information. Pieces of our story would be lopped off by other journalists who were getting the same material somehow or access to it. So we would, think we had an important piece of the story, and then we'd read about it in the Wall Street Journal or New York Times or somewhere else, and we would just be sort of like, I think at one point I said to you, Trish, I feel like I'm in the Monty Python movie, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where the Black Knight is challenging another knight to a fight, and the knight chops off his hand and chops off his other hand and then chops off his legs. And he's still saying, just a scratch, but kept fighting. But it was really hard. We were losing a lot of our story.
I think though also, it helped that we have a phenomenal editor here in Tracy, in that she reminded us, constantly to go back and to sort of delve into kind of the moral quandaries that people face. So it's, other journalists might be reporting about what happened, but what we were trying to get at was, what is it like for the people at the CDC when this is all happening, when this is all going down? In other words, like, these folks have trained their whole lives for this moment. It's like they're like the Olympic athletes of public health, and suddenly they're being told to do things that some of them know might lead to more illness and death. And so the sort of moral quandaries that these folks were facing, Tracy was reminding us to go back and ask a different kind of question, which was, what was that like for you? What did you feel like in that situation? Not just what happened, but what was that like for you personally? What did you do after that? And I think that led to kind of a different story, because the sort of wrestling that went on within the CDC over we heard from a number of people over and over again that there was this struggle internally of wanting to kind of keep their place at the table, wanting to draw the line and say, no, we believe in science, we believe in, evidence-based recommendations, this is what we do. At the same time, when they're getting overruled by folks within the administration on various things, if they stood up, would they lose their seat at the table? We kept hearing that over and over again. We're worried we're going to lose our seat at the table. And in the end, there was a lot of struggle and anger and anguish within the agency over those decisions. And, as reporters, you ask different questions when you're interested in learning about that anger and anguish than you do if you're just interested in listening to what happened. And Tracy was a phenomenal guide in reminding us that the story that we were telling was going to be different and was going to include that sort of moral reckoning.
I think also, building on that, I've covered a lot, spies and terrorists and criminals and outlaws, and those stories are inherently emotional and human and dramatic, right? And here I was always worried, we really want to tell a human story about ultimately scientists sending each other emails or, doing experiments in labs, and that's a much harder reporting and writing challenge. But I think all of us had this idea that we wanted this to be a human story where we were really focused, not just on understanding these incredibly complex topics, but also what did people look like and what did they sound like and what were details about their personality. And all of that really informed the writing. And actually the story turned out to be very dramatic and human and earthy in a way that I hadn't expected. That was one thing that surprised me, partly because of the level, as my colleagues have said, of the intensity of the emotion and the anger and the resentment, and so all of that, I think it was a different kind of story. That even if people were doing pieces of a story about the CDC, this inside human story we were trying to tell was different and in some ways I think unique because we were able to get to that level of drama and humanity and detail and color.
And what do you, one of the things that I think along the way we really tried to get at is like building scenes so that instead of reporting that something happened, we were actually there. And so what kind of elements did you use to get us in the room, and how valuable were those real-time, conversations?
I would often say, listen, if you had to make a movie about this, where would you take the cameras first? So that was like one way to get people to think about, we want to take people inside the room when these decisions are being made, when these meetings are happening, when these confrontations are happening. And some of that we were able to do by people sharing emails and documents with us, and others were by getting people who were familiar with what went on describing it. But just literally saying, like, what's the scene that you remember most? What's going to stick with you 10 years from now? When you're giving your next oral history, where are you going to take people?
And it's hard to get people to think like that sometimes when they tell you stories, especially if they're talking about something that's remarkably technical. But I think one thing that was very good about the interplay of the team is that we would build on things that our different sources told us and go to new sources and go back to that an account we already had and ask them for their version of it, right? And each time you did that, you not only pinned down the facts, but you brought out more detail and more emotion and more of the kind of thing, as you said, that really built the scene and made it vivid.
Yeah, I remember thinking I'd done an interview that was just basically pablum or something because I was so tired, and I'd type it up and then Trish, you would find a gem in it that I hadn't noticed or I was too tired. I think that was one of the best parts about this team is most of us hadn't worked together before, but we worked really well together and we all had, very different skills and strengths. So it started to get actually really exciting, as we would each feed off of each other's tidbits that we would get from interviews. And that was, to me, like the most satisfying part of the experience was to be able to work with you guys. It was just really inspiring.
So I think that one of the things I noticed is that our sources probably became completely sick of you guys because we had to be both, get people to sort of trust us with something that could cause them to lose their jobs or be disciplined, but we also had to get the science right. And one of the toughest parts of the story was the COVID test and what happened to the CDC's COVID-19 test. And I know, Trish, that you drove people crazy because the science not only had to be exactly right so that anyone who knew what they were talking about would know we didn't make a tiny mistake, but also that any reader of the public who had no background would also be able to grasp what had happened. And it was incredibly technical. And, and a lot of people that we talked to at the CDC, until they read our story, did not have a firm grasp of what had happened in the lab. Trish, can you talk a little bit about the struggle to get that section of the story right?
Yeah, I will say, we were so fortunate that we had sources who were familiar with what went on in the lab, who were not only had a great deal of technical expertise, but had the patience of a saint in terms of walking us through the science of PCR testing and how tests are developed and what went wrong with that particular test at the CDC. And we're willing to go over it and over it and over it. I mean, Tracy knows there were some interviews we did that were like 6 hours long. I mean, it was just very painstaking detail because, you know, we don't want to get it wrong. We want to do this story justice. And that a lot had been written about what happened with the CDC's testing, but we hadn't really read anything that got into the details of what happened inside the lab. And we wanted to make sure that people understood that when there was that 3-week delay from the time the problem with the test was discovered till the time that the CDC sent out new tests, that there was a lot going on behind the scenes, a lot of hard work going on, and people trying to figure out what was going on and trying to get to the bottom of it. And also there were, you know, very different people with very different points of view about what went wrong. But I think also just trying to explain the intricacies of the test and what went on with it. You know, initially, James, you can chime in here too, because I think you were part of some of these discussions, but we initially said, you know, we want to get this to like an 8th grade level, you know, so somebody who's taking, you know, 8th grade biology would understand it. And then we try that.
And then I think
say like, nope, it's got to be more like a 5th grade level. And then finally, I think we came back and, you know, one of our top editors said like, do you remember the Dick and Jane books when you were learning how to read? You know, I need you to Dick and Jane this. So then we had to go back and make it a 1st grade level. And there were people who were very patient with us as we were saying like, okay, so can't use the words primers and probes. You know, I'm thinking of using an analogy to Velcro. You know, do I have this right here? And they were extraordinarily patient and understanding, and we're very fortunate.
We even had at one point an unrelated colleague cold read it, and she was invaluable to have a cold read to say, okay, and then we went back again. So that part was a tough. I think that we are almost time to go to the questions from all these folks who are sending in questions for the team. Cynthia?
Yes. Okay, so as a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. I wanted to let everyone know that we are recording this. It's being live streamed on YouTube, so you can watch the video, the playback on ProPublica's YouTube channel after this. And also a couple questions about whether the story came out. The story was published a couple weeks ago. It's called Inside the Vault of the CDC. It's on ProPublica.org. Some of the questions came in advance. I'm going to start with one of those from Bruce. Has the CDC been so thoroughly compromised that the efficacy of any vaccine they might approve could be in question? How do we confirm that the word of the agency is accurate and true?
I'll start by saying, so the vaccine side, we have colleagues who are working on that question. And so that's a very good question, but not probably the best question for us. That's kind of outside our area of expertise.
Well, I chime in, you know, for the vaccine to work, there has to be trust. And, you know, as our story was about the currency of trust and the bankruptcy of trust, you know, the CDC and federal agencies have to work hard to rebuild trust. So that would be sort of my only point about it. People have to take the vaccine and they have to trust it to take it.
Okay, from Seymour, why was the initial COVID-19 testing so bad?
Well, we touched on this a little bit, that the CDC developed a test for COVID-19 in-house, and there were problems with that test, and there were early signs of trouble that the CDC had and that many labs around the world had, and that some of that related to when you're making a test like that, there's different components to the test. And if you make them all in-house, there's a danger of one part of the test contaminating another. And because there was such a rush to get the test out the door, the CDC did decide to make the components in-house even though they had had prior experience with another test where for a different type of coronavirus called the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, MERS, where the test did get contaminated, though those tests never went out the door. So, but there also was a debate within the CDC about whether the problem with the test was contamination or was a design flaw. And by design flaw, I mean it's sort of like almost like akin to a software bug where a part of the genetic sequences that they were using, there was a debate about whether there was a glitch that they caused sort of a glitch in the test, caused a false positive that rendered the tests useless. So still debate, I think, within the agency, as far as we know, about what was the true cause of the problem with the tests, but it did certainly. The test went out to state health departments and was quickly discovered to be causing false positives in a way that the test was rendered useless for a number of state public health labs, state and local public health labs.
That really caused the delay of 3 weeks.
Yes.
This is sort of a broad question for everyone. Can you share some of the most important or interesting, surprising discoveries that you made during your reporting?
I would say one thing that stood out to me, I think that was surprising, was in talking to folks who worked at the agency, that there were people by the late summer and early fall who worked for the CDC who no longer trusted what their own agency was saying. And who would ask when the CDC would put out guidance, they would go to other colleagues and ask, is that what we really believe?
Yeah, and the thing that really surprised me was that sort of the administration's disregard for science and was so extreme that even Trump political appointees, some of them were appalled by it. And our story gets into the sort of the anguish and, of the chief of staff, then chief of staff, who was a political appointee named Kyle McGowan. And when we learned that McGowan had been sort of the point who was trying what we were told by people to protect the science, but very unsuccessful in it. And for him, his sort of breaking point was after the CDC's powers were used to basically send refugee children back across the border in Mexico. And then he had an hour and a half on the phone with senior HHS officials in which they were trying to prevent the deportation of a dog. And they were spending much more energy on making sure this dog who might have rabies was able to stay in the country because of sort of political and social media pressure and the disregard for children. So he told people after that call that he'd really had enough, and soon after he resigned. And that was really a stark sort of moment.
I think there was this tension. We were talking to a lot of people who seemed to be agonizing over whether to leave or not. I talked to one person who did decide to leave, and part of the disgust, the disillusionment was when there was in August, when the CDC for a while put out guidance that was very hotly disputed by people in the scientific community about sort of people, whether people should get testing, or suggesting that people didn't need to get testing. They'd been around people who had COVID but weren't symptomatic. That this official told me that for the first time ever, something that you think would be extraordinary, actually told state and local health officials that he was working with to ignore the official guidance of his agency and keep doing what they had been doing. And that he had the sense that these state and local agencies were on their own, starting to not pay attention to what the CDC said and did. And he said, you know, people are going to be, now if we tell them, they're going to be like, is that really what you mean? Or is that what you're being told to say? And I thought that was a remarkable sort of, point to reach. And that was something that actually pushed him to leave.
Okay, our next question is from Jolene. Did influence over the CDC trickle down to state departments of health? Anyone?
I mean, I think part of that question was kind of answered by what I said, that there was the interactions between people at state and local departments and people at the CDC was fraught with this question, that the people who are used to sort of taking the lead from the CDC were really, befuddled and bewildered about what to do and kind of operating on their own. And we know that that some state and local officials were getting emails, for example, from a high-ranking person at the CDC saying, keep testing, to tell them that to ignore their guidance about testing. So that was, that it was clear that the relationship had changed and become strange and fraught in a way that was hard to imagine for any of the people who were dealing with it, particularly at a time of such crisis.
Okay, next question is, why do you think the CDC, quote unquote, fell so fast? What structural, cultural, or other qualities of the organization allowed this to happen?
I mean,
It
I
was
think,
structural so much as I'm sorry, James, if you want to.
no, you go first.
They were in a really horrible spot, right? In that they prepared their whole lives for an event like this. And suddenly there are people who are second guessing what some of the top infectious disease experts in the country are saying. And they're doing it, and everything was being couched in well, not everything, but many things within the administration were being couched in political terms, right? And the CDC was forced to do things that people within the agency didn't think they should. So I don't know, James, chime in here, help me out.
I mean, I think there's a vulnerability. This institution has been apolitical largely since it was started. It's in Atlanta. These people are scientists and doctors. They're not used to political shenanigans. And I don't think they ever really faced an administration like this before. I mean, maybe tell the story, it's in the story, but tell the story about the sort of moment of political influence under Obama, which really sort of tell that story, Trish.
Oh.
Yeah, with the Rahm Emanuel story.
Okay. Yeah. So one of the oral histories we read was from Rich Besser, who was the acting director of the CDC under Obama, President Obama. And the H1n1 flu pandemic began in the early spring, right, not long after President Obama was sworn in. And so a lot of the folks who were in charge were acting. In other words, they were sort of the folks who were stand-ins until the actual, the final directors got named. And Rich Besser told a story about how they had come up with, so the H1n1 flu, for those of you who don't remember this, 2009, it started in Mexico, and there were some early cases in the US, and there was a fear that this might be the big one, that this was, a very serious flu that could cause great devastation, and people were taking it very seriously within the CDC. And so they came up with a plan for very brief school closures, 1 and 2 week school closures. And Besser talked about flying to Washington, meeting with the president, and the president said, and these words sort of sticking with him, that Obama had said, whatever happens, it's all going to be, based on the best available science, and we're going to make these decisions quickly. So he's feeling good about his plan. He goes, the meeting's over. He's got a second meeting in Rahm Emanuel's office. Emanuel being Obama's chief of staff, and a somewhat, I can say this having worked as a Chicago journalist for many years, and when he was mayor, he was, he's a bit of known as an enforcer of sorts. So he goes to Emanuel's office, and he's feeling pretty good about, he's got this plan, it's going to go through for school closures. Everybody's feeling pretty kumbaya, and he's told, you know what, your plan's not going to work. And suddenly Rahm Emanuel is like scribbling on a piece of paper what he thinks the real school closure plan should be. And Rich Besser is freaking out, right? He's like, wait a second, I didn't just say we were going to base this on science. Like, I'm the only scientist in the room here. And in the end, David Axelrod, one of President Obama's senior advisors, said, you know, Rahm, I don't really think you should be, you're the guy to be writing scientific advice here, huh? And Emanuel like balls up his thing and throws it in the corner, curses, and starts eating his lunch. So, you know, that gave us a sense of how things worked in the prior administration. Not to say everything with H1n1 was perfect, but it did feel like a telling detail about how, you know, there's always an instinct for politics and science to clash. And the real question is, how do you handle that? And like I said, those oral histories were kind of a gold mine for us in terms of figuring out how did things work in the past.
A question from Mark. Why haven't, I mean, you kind of answered this, but maybe you can expound on the conversations you had. Why haven't more upper level scientists and managers become whistleblowers or resign?
So I think we touched on this a little bit in that there was a real fear that if they left, that whoever was brought in next might be even worse. And people at the CDC do feel, I mean, we talked to people who'd left 10 years ago who still talked about the agency in the present tense, like they feel incredibly protective of the place. And so I think it went way beyond, you know, the usual of, you know, it's a prestigious place to work and, you know, people need to keep, you know, their kids in college and food on their table. And it very much hinged on what's the best thing for the agency. And I think we also talked to people who felt like they were kind of a frog slowly being boiled in water. You know, you don't realize the temperature is rising until it's a little too late. And so I think there was some real division and conflict within the agency about the acquiescence at times of leaders and whether that was the right thing or the wrong thing to do. Would we be in even worse position if they were never consulted at all? You know, I don't know if we really know the answer to that question.
Can you talk a little bit about the paranoia, like the real, it's not just paranoia. There was a lot of paranoia, but also there was some clear indications that they were being, you know, like warned not to talk to the press. You know, there was some very fierce you know, folks who were appointees telling them they can't talk to anyone.
Yeah, and accusing them of sedition, you know, I mean, sedition. That's a word I didn't think I'd come across in my reporting on this. Yeah, so there was a political appointee in HHS who threatened the jobs of people, said, you know, if you talk to the press, you're unauthorized, you'll lose your job. There was all kinds of worries. People who talked to us were very courageous and put their careers on the line to try and get the truth out of what was going on.
Okay, we have a question going back to the sort of initial COVID-19 tests. Can you talk more about why the CDC declined to use the World Health Organization test in the first place?
Yeah, so the CDC came up with its design for its own test and was well underway when the German scientists came out with their test that became the World Health Organization's test. So their design was already in the works and almost done when the WHO adopted that test from the German scientists. So it wasn't, you know, the CDC was already planning on doing its own, and the work was almost done. So that's why.
So I'm getting many variations of this question. Did you get a sense from people who you talked to whether, you know, they like basically what their next steps are. Would they be willing to throw in the towel or keep hunkering through if this administration is reelected? Did any discussions of like that kind of stuff come up?
So what's interesting is, first of all, a lot of people were very concerned that this would be a political article. They didn't want to have an article that had an impact on the election. They're very apolitical people. But people have told us repeatedly that they will leave, retire, resign, if there's a second term of the president. So we have heard that from a lot of people. So I don't know what will happen. The president has an executive order which will allow him to fire policy people through all levels of government, from in every agency. So what happens next is a big question. Even if Trump loses, though, I think there's a lot of rebuilding to do. And as some folks have told us, there's question of whether the leaders can still stay, because there's been so much, the civil service leaders can stay because there's been so much erosion of trust, even as they've tried to protect the agency.
Well, and also I think there's also
the other thing I would say, just to build on what James said, is, the same way that people didn't want it to be a political article. I mean, we didn't either. There was no doubt the reporting showed there was an incredible amount of political interference, and we reported that. But what we were trying to show also were that some of these problems came from the outside because of political interference. Some came because of structural problems within the CDC and its culture. And others were a mix of factors that are, we have to take into account, like the fact of just the sheer size and ferocity of this pandemic, and the fact that it happened in China and what a pernicious global player it is. So I think we tried very hard in this article also to be nuanced and careful and fair in how we portrayed it, despite the obvious sort of charge of politics that's inherent in the topic.
I think really the big question too will be, whatever the next administration is, whoever gets elected, this sense that that this political interference doesn't belong in science. I think that's really the question that will, if that continues, I think you'll see lots of people leave, no matter who is elected.
So, Cynthia, you asked earlier about like what was one of the striking things in the story, and to me, because it kind of goes to this point, is Anne Schuchat is the top career scientist at the CDC. She's brilliant, and she was like the model for Kate Winslet, played her in the movie Contagion, and she assembles this team as the pandemic, and we have it in our stories, growing this like elite team of some of the most famous, public health scientists in the world. And by the end of our story, she goes on a sort of obscure, niche kind of JAMA podcast and says some pretty truths about when the pandemic will be over, and is pretty frank spoken. And she is so worried that she goes and talks to the chief of staff. She's like worried she's going to lose her job. And the idea that the top career scientist at the CDC in the course of this pandemic is worried about losing her job for telling the American public the truth was just striking to me, but also sort of speaks to like what would happen if the administration kept meddling. If this administration keeps going on and keeps meddling, what does it mean to the scientists of the CDC? And I think that's a real interesting question to be answered.
Let's see, how much time do we have? Can you talk a little bit about the title of the story? I'm getting a lot of questions about that. It seems that the story itself suggests that the institution has struggles, but it's not fallen, it's not failed, and that, of course, individuals and teams with integrity persist. So I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about, did the CDC, actually fall, I guess?
Well, I think anytime you have people inside the agency saying, I no longer believe what my agency is telling the public, I no longer trust that what we're saying is what we really believe versus what we're being forced or told to say, I think that really, raises questions about the health of the agency, and certainly about the trust both within the agency and within the American people. So I think that's what we were getting at. Tracy, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Well, it's interesting at ProPublica, we have other folks who help us come up with headlines. It's not, we don't come up with that, but that felt true to the readers of the story, that we started and we told this arc of what had happened since December 31st. And if you look at the story, you start out with this, brilliant, gold standard public health agency. And at the end, as I said, you have the top scientists worried about her job. You have people not trusting the guidance that they're giving out. You have people quitting. You have people worried about whether state health organizations can trust what's coming out of the CDC. That feels like a fall. Now, the big question is what happens from here? And I think that it is sort of captures the arc of the story.
Thank you.
Can I also throw in that, we're also looking for what the next story is. And so if anybody on here who's listening has an idea or something that they feel like needs journalism or needs journalists to look at, we're all ears. So, keep us in mind.
That's piggybacks another question that was in the comments. I mean, are you, regardless of what other tips you get, are you already working on a follow-up story, or is that too soon to say?
We have ideas and we're talking about and pursuing them.
Okay, we have time for one more question. And thank you so much for the dozens of questions that have come in, but it's a 1 hour event. And I'd like to have Tracy close out the panel for some closing thoughts here.
So I was looking at some of the questions that were coming in, and a lot of folks have talked about our ramping up in order to tell this story and telling it in this certain way. And, these last questions have sort of looked at what do we think, the agency as a fall, but in telling the story this way, what do you think, how does it have more impact in telling it this way? What does it do for our readers, and what is the legacy of a story that sort of gets you inside the agency?
I think we've all had that experience that we may be following an issue in the press and think we understand it well, but finally that one narrative comes along that puts it all together. You know what I mean? Where we feel like the average reader has learned something from it. But what has struck me with this story, that compared to stories in the past, to even have sources tell you, wow, you put together in a way that there were things in there that I didn't know about, or that made sense for the first time, or that I think is the great sort of compliment you can get on a story like that, is that that people feel that it's something they know about because this story was out there constantly, but that for readers and even for experts, it was sort of a big, complete, comprehensive telling of it that gave them new insight.
I think also, just building on what Sebastian said, conveying the emotion of folks who were there, and this notion of something special was really lost or is in danger of being lost here. And I think that resonates for people who see news about COVID every day, and maybe they see the CDC as a bureaucracy or as this place that deals with science, and not realizing that it has this very proud history and very talented people working there, and that those folks were put in extraordinarily difficult situations that forced them to make decisions that they might not normally have made. And I think conveying that to readers and the sort of the drama of that narrative helps bring home what's at stake, for our country.
James, you're
muted, James.
We can deride the people who work in government as bureaucrats or deep staters, but they're people, a lot of these people put their lives on the line in past epidemics. for us. We wanted to understand, what happened when things went wrong, and make people understand what these institutions are, and actually, I don't want us to care about an institution after it's gone, and I think that's a possibility.
All right, and I think it was important in the course of this that we showed what they did wrong and what they, where their missteps were. And it's, instead of having them be sort of passively something that was done to them, we had them as an active, player. And I think that will allow people to take a look at the story and see, okay, here's where they went wrong. Here's things that went wrong, but also here's where we can never let it go wrong again, which I think hopefully that's a takeaway.
Okay, well, thank you. That's our time for today. If you haven't already, you can get invitations to more events like this by signing up for ProPublica's Big Story newsletter, propublica.org/newsletters. And thank you to our speakers, and from all of us at ProPublica, thank you for joining us today. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.